welcome back to Rabbits Forever. So today I wanted to talk about breeding. And this is kind of further into breeding other than just 101. Little bunny that I brought out for you guys to kind of watch, even though this doesn't really have anything to do with her, is my breeding doe Dahlia. She just got off a litter and is looking fantastic, so thought I'd bring her out for everybody to see. But the breeding I wanted to talk about that's a little bit more than 101, other than just putting, the doe in with the buck and doing that stuff, is whether you can breed siblings, whether you can breed a mom to a son, or a daughter to a father, and so on and so forth, kind of stuff like that. So a lot of this you're not going to get into unless you get deep into breeding and you're okay with culling your animals, which is just butchering them and throwing them in the freezer, because when you do this type of breeding, you're going to get the worst of the worst out of your litters and the best of the best. So usually you only do this if you're breeding for show animals and you know your lines, and like I said before, you're willing to cull your animals and throw them in the freezer. Because when I say worst of worst, if your lines have genetic issues like cataracts or screw tail, rye tail, any of that stuff, miscolorations, ear problems and lops and stuff like that, teeth problems, any malocclusion with their mouths, any eye problems, any genetic disorders that a rabbit can have, if your lines carry them, even if you don't know that they carry them, it can and probably will be brought out if you're breeding like sister to brother or something like that. That one, you're definitely going to get the best of the best and the worst of the worst. Breeding a son to a mother or something like that, it's definitely not going to give you as dramatic results as if you bred a sister and a brother. But breeding offspring to parents, that is kind of your first step into learning about your lines and breeding heavier into your lineage, because that's still going to give you better results. For instance, if she ended up having a son that looked a little bit better than her, which, let's get her all scrunched up here. So if I was ever going to breed her to one of her sons, I would breed her with a son that had a further back point or slightly more open ears. From this distance, you can't really see that, but just as an example, that's the only reason I would really breed her with one of her sons. Hopefully the buck that I have currently that I'm going to be breeding her with, he's out of a lot of Grand Champ parents, a lot of Grand Champ lineage in general. His father was actually best of breed at ARBA Convention 2019 last year. So I'm hoping he can give him and her can produce really nice offspring, because she's actually more deep than he is, like depth wise. So if I ended up having a buck that looked better than her or something out of that litter, I may keep him and breed her back. But that just depends if that buck looks better than the father. If it doesn't look better than the father in other aspects, I may or may not. It really depends on what you're looking for. Like I said, what I'm looking for is a little bit wider ear base, just slightly wider ear base, which the buck that I have definitely has. I would like a little bit wider crown base as well on her, but that I'm honestly not that picky about, because she has a very nice crown base. She also has very strong shoulders, which the buck I have currently does as well. The lines that I work with typically have very strong shoulders, so I'm not worried about that. This peak I would like to move back over the hip just slightly. Maybe like a little couple centimeters kind of thing. Thickness of ear I'm not worried about or anything like that. So that's just what I'm looking for. And if I ended up finding a son or a daughter that looked better than her or their father, I would end up breeding them back to C. Now, if you're wanting to get your full genetic potential out of your stock, I definitely would suggest breeding sister to brother. So breeding these, her as well as my buck together, if the entire litter turns out really nicely, I may end up keeping a buck and a doe out of the litter to breed together, just because that would bring to, hopefully, this is what you hope for. It's never guaranteed. Obviously, if you've done any breeding of any species, any breed, anything before, you always know you never know what you're going to get until you breed it, or if you know your lines. And even then, sometimes you get stuff that pop up and you just sit back and you're like, where did that even come from? Seriously, where did it come from? Because you could have owned their great-great-grandsire and dam, and you still end up with just some random little hopper in the mix that you just really don't know where it came from. For instance, she's been producing selfs, and all through her pedigree, I don't believe she has any self. Which self is blue, blacks, chocolates, stuff like that. It's the agouti gene. She doesn't have the agouti gene, she just has the self genes. She only has the agouti genes. She shouldn't have the self genes, but somewhere along her lines, she ended up picking up an agouti gene or a self gene, and it just continued to pass on to her. She just miraculously got that, which fun for me. I love self colors. That's actually what I wanted to breed a couple years ago, but it's a lot easier to get a hold of agoutis that are better quality than getting a hold of selfs. It's more, at least for me, it's been more difficult to find selfs that are equal in quality as an agouti. You can find them, it just depends how close they are to you and cost and all that. These ones were more cost effective. Plus, I personally know the breeder of these guys. I've known him for many years, and he's an incredible breeder, and that's why I ended up getting these guys. I don't mind steels. I think they're beautiful. I just have always really wanted to produce like blues and lilacs and chocolates and stuff like that, which eventually I'll get there, but that's not what this video is about. Let me get back on track. But for instance, so where I trailed off on was brother and sister. If I ended up breeding brother and sister, what I would hope for is that I would get that peak to move back if one of those siblings has that in them. Genetically, I obviously won't know unless I do it. I'd hope for strong shoulders, which I'm basically guaranteed with both parents. I'm hoping for maybe a wider base. Her and the sire both have a very wide base, so I'm not really worried about that. I just want to keep my eye on that because you never know, you could get the worst as well, like I said. So you could get pinched loin, you could get a chopped off, you could just chop off right there, and you don't want that. You could get weak shoulders, you could get a slipped crown, you could get pinched ears, all of that. Because like I said, you're going to get breeding siblings, you're going to get the best of the best and the worst of the worst. There is really no in between there, so you're wanting to cull out everything you don't like and just keeping the ones that look the best to you, and you can either sell them, you could keep one or two out of that litter and cull the rest and not even deal with selling to other breeders who may or may not approve that. it's molting season, so I'm having random fur fly all over my face, and that's why you'll see me pause and kind of push something away. But yeah, so all of that, as I said, kind of a sum up of this video. Breeding offspring to their parents is kind of a beginner step. You're never going to get something that's absolutely the worst thing you've ever seen. I mean, every once in a while, yes, you're going to get that because, you're still playing with genetics. Breeding siblings together, you are going to get the worst of the worst and the best of the best. And breeding siblings is when you may or may not, depending on what's in your lines and what's not, you may end up getting genetic issues. Those genetic issues that are in your lines will be presented. You're not going to get genetic issues from breeding sibling to sibling just because you bred siblings. That's not how genes work. Now, if you do that over a long period of time, yes, you are, because then you're too closely breeding them. So if you take sibling to sibling, and then out of that offspring you take sibling to sibling, and so on and so forth, yes, you are going to create genetic issues in your lines. But if you do it once or twice, it is really unlikely that you're going to. That's also how you breed for, how do I put this? That's also how you breed more accurate animals. So I don't even know how to describe this, but when you breed your animals together, you want all the babies to look almost the same. You want all of them to have the same traits and look almost identical. And breeding sibling to sibling and offspring to parents is how you get that, because then you're working with the same genealogy and just continuing it. And then when you get outcrosses and stuff like that, that's when you're adding in new genealogy, and they're going to add in a whole new set of traits that could or could not be presented. It just, like I said, all depends on your traits and depends on your lines and which ones are more dominant and which ones are more recessive. Going further into this is honestly going to get even more confusing, but that's kind of the basics of, it's one step above the rabbit breeding 101 pretty much, is breeding with, as I said, siblings to siblings or offspring to parents. So it really just depends on how you feel about it and whether you're willing to cull your animals or not. If you don't feel comfortable culling animals, I suggest you do not do this. You just breed two unrelated pairs, and don't focus on breeding or inbreeding your animals, inbreeding if you want to call it that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I said, if you don't feel comfortable with culling your animals, definitely just get two unrelated pair, because then you don't really have any worries there about dealing with genetics that you don't want to deal with. If you do feel comfortable and you know the basics of rabbits and you've been breeding for a little bit, I definitely don't suggest breeding siblings or anything like that, especially when you're first starting, because you're still learning about your rabbit genetics and stuff like that. But once you've got a good hand on it and you already have, you have good lines and stuff like that, then definitely you could try that. But you do have to be okay with butchering your animals, because like I said before, you are going to get the worst of the worst. But like I said, for show purposes, you are going to get the best of the best as well in your lines if you do that. So I hope that helps anybody out there, and thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day.